The engine coughed, then coughed again, and inside the cramped cockpit of a B-25 Mitchell bomber, Lieutenant Ted Lawson watched the needle on his fuel gauge settle dead against the empty peg. It was almost midnight on April 18, 1942. Below him, the coastal hills of Zhejiang Province lay blacked out under a moonless sky, no lights, no landmarks, nothing but rain streaking the windscreen and 2 engines running on fumes. He and his crew had just flown farther than any B-25 crew in history, bombed Tokyo, and turned for China with no fuel to spare and no runway waiting for them. Here is the number that got remembered. 80 American airmen flew that mission, and 64 of them made it home. Here is the number that did not get remembered. In the months after, Chinese wartime estimates cited by Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek himself and endorsed by U.S. General Claire Chennault placed the death toll from Japan's retaliation as high as 250,000 men, women, and children. No one ever counted the bodies precisely enough to be sure. What is certain is that a war-winning raid over Tokyo came with a bill paid almost entirely by farmers who had never touched a rifle, in a story that all but vanished from the history books. Lawson pulled the release and dropped through the belly hatch into black, wet air, the sound of his own bomber already fading above him. For a half-second, tumbling through nothing, he caught sight of his crew scattering into the fog over the ridgelines of Zhejiang. 4 dark shapes drifting apart into a country none of them could name on a map. Then the fog swallowed them whole. He would not know for hours whether any of them had survived the landing. To understand what waited for him on the ground, and what it would eventually cost the people who found him, the story has to start 10 weeks earlier, on the other side of the Pacific. 4 months earlier, the United States was a country still reeling. Pearl Harbor had been bombed on December 7, 1941, and Americans wanted something, anything, that struck back at Japan directly. President Roosevelt asked his commanders for exactly that. A raid on the Japanese home islands, something no one thought was even possible from land-based bombers flying off a Navy carrier. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, a 45-year-old air racer and engineer, said it could be done. He needed volunteers willing to fly a mission he could not fully explain to them yet, because even he did not know exactly how it would end. Ted Lawson signed up without asking too many questions. He was 24 years old, from La Junta, Colorado, the kind of pilot other pilots trusted with their lives without thinking twice about it. His B-25 carried the nickname Ruptured Duck painted in white letters near the nose, and a crew of 4 men who had trained with him for weeks in Florida, practicing takeoffs on a runway painted to the exact length of an aircraft carrier's deck. None of them had ever taken off from an actual ship before. On April 18, 1942, 467 nautical miles further from Japan than the mission plan called for, they would have to learn how on the day it counted. Sergeant Leland Factor flew as Lawson's engineer gunner, a stocky 25-year-old from Iowa with a crew cut and a worn leather logbook he kept strapped to his gear, recording engine hours and fuel burn in a small, careful hand. He was not the kind of man who talked about being scared. He checked instruments instead, over and over, the way some men prayed. Factor had volunteered for the Doolittle mission the same way most of the 80 men had, told only that it was dangerous, that it was important, and that he did not have to go. He went anyway, and he brought his logbook with him. In the breast pocket of his flight jacket, folded into a square no bigger than a matchbook, Lawson carried a photograph of his wife, Ellen. He had looked at it so many times during training that the crease lines had gone soft and pale. He did not tell the other men much about her, only that she was waiting for him in Los Angeles, and that he intended to come home. On the morning of the launch, with the carrier's deck pitching under 20-knot gusts and rain blowing sideways across the flight line, he checked 2 things before he climbed into the cockpit: his fuel load and that the photo was still there. 7,000 miles from that carrier deck, in the low green hills of Zhejiang Province, a farmer named Ma Eng-lin worked fields his family had worked for generations, unaware that his province was about to become the most important stretch of ground in the entire war effort against Japan. Zhejiang's coast sat along the route Doolittle's planners had chosen, close enough to China's wartime capital to matter, far enough from Japanese-held cities to offer a chance. Villages like Ma's had spent 5 years living beside a war they had not started, learning which roads were watched, which nights were safe to travel, and which strangers could be trusted. Father Wendelin Dunker, a heavy-set German missionary in his 40s, who had spent years working the Zhejiang countryside, kept a leather satchel of letters he could not send, records of a province the outside world had mostly stopped watching. Years later, describing what the same countryside would look like after the reprisals, he wrote plainly, "Like a swarm of locusts, they left behind nothing but destruction." In the spring of 1942, that satchel was still thin. It would not stay that way for long. At the center of Ma England's village stood a stone-lined well, the kind every family in the district drew from twice a day, for cooking water, for washing, for the animals that kept them fed. Children filled buckets there before school. Old men sat near it in the evenings, trading news carried in by traveling merchants, and, increasingly, by nationalist soldiers moving quietly through the hills. It was an unremarkable well in an unremarkable village, the sort of place that never appeared on any map that mattered to a general. That was about to change. By the spring of 1942, Zhejiang's villages were laced with a loose, dangerous network. Nationalist guerrillas moving under cover of night, local militia who knew every footpath and false trail, and missionaries like Father Dunker who could translate between worlds that otherwise had no common language. None of them knew a single American bomber crew was coming. But the machinery that would find those crews, hide them, feed them, and pass them hand to hand towards safety was already in place, built over years for exactly this kind of emergency, without anyone imagining what it would actually be used for. So there they stood, an ocean apart and utterly unaware of each other. A Colorado pilot with his wife's photograph folded soft in his pocket, an Iowa sergeant with a logbook full of careful numbers, a German priest with an empty satchel waiting to be filled, and a farmer drawing water from a well his grandfather had dug. In a matter of weeks, all of their lives would be pulled into the same narrow stretch of Chinese coastline. None of them had asked for it. None of them could have stopped it. The mission that would connect them was already being loaded onto a ship in California harbor. Just before dawn on April 18, 1942, a lookout aboard the carrier Hornet spotted a small vessel wallowing on the horizon, roughly 650 nautical miles from the coast of Japan. It was the picket boat Nito Maru, one of dozens strung across the northern Pacific to warn Tokyo of exactly this kind of approach. Cruisers opened fire and sank her within minutes, but the damage was already done. Radio operators had almost certainly gotten a warning off. Vice Admiral William Halsey signaled Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, 2 words that changed everything: launch immediately. The mission, built around a careful 400-mile approach, would now begin 250 miles farther out than any of the 16 crews had trained for. On a heaving flight deck slick with rain, 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers waited nose to tail, wingtips just feet from Hornets Island superstructure. 20-knot gusts tore across the bow, and seawater broke over the deck edge with every roll of the ship. Doolittle went first, using barely 500 feet of runway before hauling his bomber into the gray sky, a feat that startled even his own crews. One by one the others followed, engines howling against the wind, each pilot timing his throttle to the pitch of the deck beneath him. Every plane cleared the deck safely. But the extra 250 miles they now had to fly meant fuel gauges began dropping the moment each aircraft leveled off, before the mission had even truly started. By midday, the 16 bombers came in low over Tokyo, Yokohama, Yokosuka, Nagoya, Kobe, and Osaka, skimming rooftops at altitudes as low as 100 feet to drop their bombs on factories, oil tanks, and military targets. It was the first time bombs had fallen on the Japanese home island since the war began, and the raid killed 87 people and injured more than 150 seriously, while damaging or destroying over 100 buildings. The physical damage was modest. The psychological damage was not. But for the 80 American airmen now turning west toward China, the celebration lasted only minutes. Every one of them understood the same brutal arithmetic. They had already burned fuel they did not have to spare, and China was still hours away. Somewhere over the East China Sea, in bomber after bomber, navigators bent over fuel gauges and did the same grim math. The plan had called for landing at an airfield near Quuzhou in Zhejiang province, where lights and a friendly ground crew were supposed to be waiting. But the extra 250 miles from the early launch, combined with a headwind no one had briefed for, had eaten through reserves that were never meant to stretch this far. Crews kept radio silence, worked their throttles for maximum range, and reached the same private conclusion one by one. They were not going to make it to Quozhou. Night was falling over the China coast, and Quozhou's runway lights, dimmed under blackout order, would never even be lit for them. Aboard the ruptured duck, Lieutenant Ted Lawson felt the left engine begin to surge and cough somewhere over the black coastline of Zhejiang. Rain streaked the windscreen. Below, there were no lights at all, no city glow, no runway beacon, nothing but a formless dark that could have been ocean, mountains, or rice paddies. Sergeant Factor, working the fuel transfer by feel, called out numbers that kept getting worse. Lawson held the bomber level as long as he could, searching for any break in the clouds that might show him solid ground. Somewhere below, in a village he had never heard of, Ma Anglin looked up at the sound of straining engines passing low overhead into the storm. From the moment Hornet's flight deck emptied to the moment the last surviving bomber came down in China, the 16 crews covered nearly 2,250 nautical miles, the longest combat mission a B-25 had ever flown. No aircraft in the raid had been designed for a flight that long, and every modification made in the weeks before, stripped gun turrets, extra fuel bladders welded into the bomb bays, had been built around one number, 400 miles from ship to target. That number no longer applied. Instead, 16 aircrews found themselves stretching planes built for short hauls across open ocean, enemy coastline, and finally a stretch of mountainous Chinese province they had only seen on briefing maps, hoping the margins held. The launch itself, hours earlier, had been closer to a controlled catastrophe than a routine takeoff. Hornet's deck pitched through steep rolls, spray came over the bow in sheets, and ground crews braced against the wind just to keep their footing near the idling engines. Doolittle's bomber lifted off first, into a headwind that briefly seemed to stop his climb altogether, then cleared the bow with feet to spare. 15 more followed at intervals of roughly 4 minutes, each pilot fighting the same pitching deck, the same crosswind, the same margin for error measured in single feet of runway. Not one aircraft was lost in the launch. It would be the last uncomplicated success of the entire mission. Over Japan, the bombers split onto planned routes, dropping incendiaries and demolition bombs on factories, oil storage tanks, and military installations in 6 cities. Anti-aircraft fire was scattered and largely inaccurate at the low altitudes the B-25s flew, and only one aircraft took meaningful damage over the target area. The raid killed 87 people in Japan and injured more than 150 seriously, numbers American planners would not fully learn until much later. For the crews themselves, there was no time to register the results. Bomb bay doors closed, throttles went forward, and 16 aircraft turned west, climbing for altitude and fuel economy, racing a clock none of them could see. The flight toward China ran into darkness, then into storm. Cloud decks forced some crews down to a few hundred feet above black water, then up again as mountains rose out of the murk along the coast. Radio stayed silent by order, so no pilot could ask another how his fuel was holding, only guess from the sound of engines running lean. Somewhere behind them, still burning, were the cities they had just bombed. Somewhere ahead, if the maps were right, was an airfield with landing lights that would guide them home. None of the 15 crews now approaching the Chinese coast would ever see those lights. The 16th aircraft, farther north and lower on fuel than the others, was already turning toward Soviet territory instead. One after another, through the night of April 18 and into the early hours of April 19, the bombers ran out of options over Zhejiang and Jiangxi provinces. Some crews bailed out into driving rain, parachutes snapping open over terrain they could not see. Others rode their aircraft down in controlled crash landings, choosing rice paddies, hillsides, or riverbanks by instinct more than sight. 15 aircraft came down across a stretch of coastal China roughly 200 miles wide. Not one reached the airfield at Quozhou. In the confusion of impact, fire, and total darkness, 80 men scattered across unfamiliar ground had no way of knowing yet who among them had survived the landing at all. Sergeant Leland Factor did not survive his. Somewhere in the crash sequence, in country he had never set foot in before that night, the young engineer gunner from Iowa was killed, becoming the raid's first casualty before a single Japanese soldier had come looking for any of them. His crewmates carried the loss with them into the hills, alongside injuries, empty stomachs, and no working radio. It was a quiet, almost unremarked death in the middle of a much louder story, the kind that rarely makes it into headlines about a daring raid on Tokyo. But for the men who had trained beside him weeks earlier, it was the first proof of what this mission was going to cost. Lieutenant Ted Lawson brought the ruptured duck down in the surf just off the Zhejiang coast, the impact driving his legs into the instrument panel with enough force to tear the flesh to the bone. His crew pulled him from the wreckage half-conscious, the Pacific tide already working at the fuselage behind them. There was no airfield, no ambulance, no working radio, only darkness, cold water, and a stretch of unfamiliar shoreline. Lawson later said he expected to die on that beach. Instead, within hours, shapes began moving toward them out of the dark. Men from a nearby village who had heard the crash and come to see what had fallen from the sky. Word of the crash landings moved through the Zhejiang Hills faster than any Japanese patrol could follow. Farmers like Ma Englin left their fields and waded into flooded paddies at night, calling softly into the dark for any American who could hear them. Village militia fanned out along ridgelines with lanterns hooded against the rain, checking barns, temple grounds, and dry riverbeds. None of them had ever seen an American before. Few had ever seen an airplane up close. What they understood, without needing to be told twice, was that these strangers had bombed the country that had been bombing them for 5 years, and that finding them before Japanese search parties did was now the most urgent task in the district. Reverend Herbert Vandenberg watched the first exhausted airman stumble into his mission station days after the crash, coats torn, boots ruined by miles of mountain trail. He later described what he saw in words that stayed with the villagers who had fed them. "They came to us on foot. They were tired and hungry," Vandenberg recalled. It was a small, plain sentence for what had actually happened. Strangers risking Japanese reprisal to feed men they could not even speak to. Father Wendelin Dunker's mission became one of dozens of such way stations strung across the two provinces, tiny outposts where German and American missionaries, who had lived in China for years, now found themselves translating between frightened farmers and shell-shocked young men from Colorado, Iowa, and a dozen other states. Dunker fed them, dressed what wounds he could, and pointed guides toward the next safe house inland. Grateful and half in shock, some airmen pressed small tokens into their host's hands before moving on: buttons, coins, a scrap of parachute silk, whatever they had to offer in place of words neither side could speak. No one thought yet to wonder what those small gifts might mean if a Japanese patrol ever found them. Reverend Charles Mias, watching villagers pocket those same tokens as keepsakes, wrote something later that read less like gratitude and more like warning. Little did the Doolittle men realize that those same little gifts, Mias wrote, would one day be used as evidence against the very people who had saved them. The kindness moving hand to hand across Zhejiang that spring was about to become, in the eyes of the Japanese army, a crime. By the third week of April, word had reached farmers across the hills of Zhejiang. Reprisal, when it came, would not distinguish between the guilty and the innocent. Village elders met in low mud-walled houses to weigh a question that had only one honest answer once it was spoken aloud: feed the flyers or turn them away. Ma Englin, who farmed 3 terraced acres of rice near the coast road, was among those who chose to keep feeding them. He later told missionaries he had not thought of it as bravery. It was simply what a neighbor did for a stranger starving on his doorstep. By most accounts, it was Ma Englin who led the next stretch of Lawson's exhausted crew, his bamboo-carrying pole loaded with whatever food he could spare, moving the men off the main trail whenever dogs barked in the distance. He knew the ridgelines the way a man knows his own field, which gully flooded after spring rain, which farmhouse 2 doors down kept ties to the Japanese. He did not ask the airmen their names. He asked only how far they could still walk before dark, and then led them another 5 miles toward the coast. The coast itself was the danger now. Japanese patrol boats worked the inlets by day, and shore parties combed fishing villages by lamplight after dark, asking after tall foreigners no one in the district had supposedly seen. Every guide who moved an airman toward open water was gambling with more than his own. One frightened word from a neighbor could cost an entire family. Still, the network held. farmers, schoolteachers, a handful of nationalist militia, and missionaries like Father Dunker kept the chain of safe houses moving one dark field at a time. By the last week of April, cables reached the wartime capital of Chungking carrying a number few had dared hope for 3 weeks earlier. Of the 80 men who had flown off USS Hornet, the great majority were alive, moving inland under Chinese guard one farmhouse at a time. For Chiang Kai-shek's government, already anxious about what Japan might do to the villages that had sheltered them, the relief was real but short-lived. Lieutenant Lawson was still stranded near the coast, his leg wound darkening by the day, and safety remained many miles away. Ted Lawson's left leg had been crushed and torn open in the crash landing of the ruptured duck, and by the time villagers moved him inland, the wound had gone past anything a farmhouse dressing could manage. The skin around it was hot to the touch, the color shifting from red to a deep, worrying purple. The smell rising from beneath the bandage told the men around him exactly what infection meant in a place with no hospital for 100 miles. Without surgery within days, his crewmates understood Lawson would lose more than the leg. The nearest flight surgeon who could operate was Thomas White, traveling with another scattered crew, and reaching him meant crossing water the Japanese Navy patrolled nightly. Local boatmen who had fished that same stretch of coast their whole lives agreed to try anyway, choosing a moonless night and wrapping cloth around their oars to muffle the sound. They laid Lawson in the bottom of a small wooden boat, packed blankets around him to keep him quiet, and pushed off from the beach a little after midnight, watching the dark water for running lights that never came close enough to find them. For nearly 2 hours the boat crept along the coastline, hugging shadows thrown by the cliffs, the boatmen reading the current more than any compass. Twice they went still and silent, oars lifted dripping from the water, while the beam of a searchlight swept the bay and passed on without finding them. Lawson drifted in and out of consciousness in the bottom of the boat, aware mostly of cold water sloshing against the planks and the careful breathing of the men beside him, as if breath itself might carry across open water to Japanese ears. They reached the fishing village near dawn, and word was already waiting for them. Doc White, the flight surgeon, had arrived 2 days earlier with another crew and a battered meant for minor combat wounds, not for what he found when he unwrapped Lawson's bandage. White examined the leg by lamplight, the muscle tissue dying below the knee, and told the men crowded into the small room what he suspected they already knew. There was no saving it. The only question left was whether there was any way to save Lawson. The crew's entire medical supply held exactly 1 dose of spinal anesthesia, kept without anyone quite planning for a day like this. White used it now, working by kerosene lamp on a wooden table a Chinese family had cleared of everything else in the house. He amputated Lawson's leg above the knee with instruments meant for field dressings, not surgery, while 2 crewmates held him steady and a village woman boiled water again and again in the next room, because it was the only thing left she had to give him. Lawson survived the night, weak and gray but breathing evenly by sunrise, and for the first time in days the house around him allowed itself something close to relief. A family 2 doors down sent over fried chicken and rice cakes for the crew, more food than they could easily spare, carried in by a boy who would not meet anyone's eyes. Reverend Herbert Vandenberg, visiting other stranded airmen 30 miles inland that same week, saw the same quiet generosity repeated village after village, exhausted men fed by people who had almost nothing themselves. Not every crew found that kind of relief. Engineer gunner Leland Factor had been killed in the crash landing days earlier, one of only 3 Americans lost in the scatter across Zhejiang, and his crewmates carried what little of him they could. His worn leather logbook, filled with fuel figures and flight times in his own hand, passed from man to man as they moved inland, tucked inside a jacket the way a photograph might be. No one spoke much about why they kept it. They simply made sure, at each handoff, that it did not get left behind. Along the coast, the search for the Americans had stopped resembling a manhunt for downed airmen and started resembling an occupation. Japanese shore patrols doubled, then doubled again, moving through fishing towns with names supplied by informers and threats that grew louder with each empty house they searched. Guides who had once moved airmen after dark now waited 2 or 3 extra days before risking the same route twice, watching soldiers question the same families who had quietly fed strangers only a week before. It was near the coast, in the last week of the search, that the net finally closed on 8 of the 80. Separated from their kaikazans and cornered in open ground with nowhere left to run, they were taken by Japanese soldiers and marched away under guard, hands raised, their part in the raid over inside a few minutes. 3 of the 8 men marched away that afternoon would not live to see the following October. Within weeks, reports reaching Chungking described something larger gathering along the coast than a search for stray flyers. Japanese commanders were massing an army, eventually numbering close to 180,000 troops backed by dozens of artillery battalions, aimed not only at finding Americans but at erasing every airfield in Zhejiang and Jiangxi that might one day launch a bomber toward Japan again. Missionaries who had lived in the region for decades began writing letters home earlier than usual that spring, the kind of letters that tried, without quite saying it, to say goodbye. Father Wendelin Dunker had served in these hills for years and knew what an ordinary hard season looked like. What came next, he later wrote, was nothing like that. Like a swarm of locusts, they left behind nothing but destruction. Dunker recalled of the army now moving toward his parish. The rescue was over. What followed would not spare the people who had made it possible. On June 11, the offensive began in earnest. Japanese infantry crossed into Zhejiang and Jiangxi behind artillery fire, moving inland from the coast in columns that would eventually cover roughly 20,000 square miles of farmland and market towns. Soldiers entered village after village, questioning elders, burning grain stores, and searching thatched roofs for anyone who had sheltered a stranger back in April. Some towns saw the army pass through in a single afternoon. Others watched soldiers stay for weeks, moving door to door with the same short list of questions. In Kwojou district alone, the reckoning was kept with the same precision the Japanese army applied to everything it destroyed. Post-war counts found 1,131 separate raids and sweeps across the district, 10,246 people killed, and 62,146 homes burned or pulled apart, leaving 27,456 residents with nothing at all. Nearly 8,000 head of cattle were seized for army rations. Kwojou had been the intended landing field for the Doolittle bombers. Not one of them ever reached it. The district paid for that runway anyway. Yushan had once been a market town of solid brick houses and busy trade in tea and paper. By the time Japanese troops finished with it, roughly 80% of those houses were gone and some 2,000 residents were dead. Father Bill Stein, a missionary who had lived there for years, walked the streets afterward and could not find the town he remembered. Whole blocks he had known by name were reduced to broken walls, cold ash, and the outlines of houses that no longer stood. Nanchang burned for 3 days before the fires were finally allowed to die. Reverend Frederick McGuire had ministered there for years and stayed through the occupation that followed. For 1 month the Japanese remained in Nanchang, roaming the rubble-filled streets. He later wrote of the city he no longer recognized. Few Western witnesses saw more of that summer than he did. The well at the center of Ma Englin's village had drawn clean water for 3 generations, the kind neighbors lined up for at dawn with wooden buckets swinging from bamboo-carrying poles. Soldiers did not need to burn every house to make a village unlivable. They threw in what was close at hand: dead livestock, spoiled grain, whatever would rot fastest. By the second week, the water that had sustained the village for 100 years ran the color of rust and could not be used at all. Ma Eng-lin had guided pilot Harold Watson through the hills back in April, sharing rice and steering him clear of patrols along the coast road. Someone in a neighboring town later gave his name to the Japanese army. Soldiers came for him specifically, not as part of a general sweep but by name. By most accounts of villagers who survived that summer, he was burned alive in the same fields he had once walked with the American he had helped save. His name survives today only because a handful of witnesses refused to let it disappear. Through all of it, Father Dunker kept writing. The leather satchel he had once used for parish letters and church business now filled with something else entirely. Dates, place names, scrap casualty counts down by candlelight after villagers arrived at his door with what they had seen. He knew the pages were dangerous to keep and more dangerous to send. He kept them anyway, folded flat against his chest under his cassock, waiting for a way out of the province that did not yet exist. In the Linchuan district near Nanchang, a town of roughly 50,000 people, soldiers herded some 800 women into a single storehouse. What happened inside over the days that followed, missionaries later described in careful, restrained language meant for readers who would still believe it. Relief workers who surveyed the region afterward found that out of 28 market towns in that stretch of country, only 3 had escaped the campaign largely untouched. The other 25 carried its marks for years. Father Dunker did not soften what he had watched for the letters he eventually smuggled out of the province. They shot any man, woman, child, cow, hog, or just about anything that moved. He wrote of the soldiers passing through his parish that summer. He was one of the only Western witnesses still close enough to write it down at all. As Japanese forces began pulling back toward the coast in August, a different kind of unit moved in behind them. Under the command of Shiro Ishii, teams from the biological warfare program known as Unit 731 arrived carrying sealed containers of cultured pathogens, plague, anthrax, cholera, and paratyphoid, grown for exactly this purpose. Their orders had nothing to do with hunting down airmen. The withdrawal itself had become the weapon, and the wells and fields of Zhejiang and Jiangxi were the target. Peptone flasks labeled deceptively as ordinary drinking water were emptied into village wells the army was abandoning. Roughly 3,000 rolls of food laced with disease were left behind for hungry civilians and Chinese soldiers to find, along with some 400 biscuits scattered across fields to look like discarded army rations. By the time the sickness ran its course, an estimated 1,700 Japanese soldiers had died of cholera contracted in their own campaign, and untold numbers of Chinese villagers were sick or dying in the same wells and fields the army left behind. Far to the east, in a Japanese military prison in Shanghai, the 8 captured airmen had no way of knowing what was happening in the hills where they had once been hidden and fed. That October, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz were brought before a military tribunal on charges written for the occasion. Accused of machine-gunning civilians during the raid itself, a claim their own crews and mission records contradicted. The verdict had been decided well before the proceedings ended. On the morning of October 15, 1942, the 3 men were driven to a cemetery outside the city and given a few minutes to write final letters home. Letters their families would not receive for years. None of the 3 left any record of anger toward the villagers who had tried to save them back in April. What they had seen of that kindness, they carried with them to the end. At the appointed hour, Dean Hallmark, William Farrow, and Harold Spatz were led out and executed by firing squad, 3 of the 80 men who had flown off the Hornets deck 6 months before. Word of their deaths would not reach the American public until more than a year later. For the villages of Zhejiang and Jiangxi, still counting their own dead that October, the airmen's fate was one more grief folded quietly into a summer that had already taken so much. Ted Lawson lived. The amputation on a farmhouse table cost him his right leg above the knee, but by midsummer he was aboard a hospital ship bound for San Francisco. The small creased photograph of his wife still tucked in his breast pocket, its corners worn soft from 6 months of handling. In 1943, he published 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, the first full account most Americans would read of the raid and of the rescue that followed it through the hills of Zhejiang. He never described the men and women who carried him as strangers. He gave them a name that would outlast the war itself. They were not soldiers, and they owed us nothing. Lawson wrote of the farmers and fishermen who ferried him past a Japanese blockade to reach a doctor. I called them my United Nations because no 2 of them spoke the same dialect, and none of them spoke mine. The line appeared in his 1943 memoir, one of the few American accounts to name, even briefly, the ordinary people history was already forgetting. Sergeant Leland Factor never saw the villages that later sheltered his crewmates. He was one of 3 men lost in the crash landings themselves, buried first in China and later brought home to Iowa. The worn leather logbook he had carried on a strap through training, and the raid was returned to his family. Its final entries: fuel burned, altitude, heading, stopping mid-line somewhere over the Chinese coast. Of the 8 airmen later captured, 3 were executed, 1 died in a Japanese prison, and 4 lived to see August 1945 and liberation. Generalissimo Chiang Kai-shek cabled Washington that Japan's retaliation had cost as many as 250,000 Chinese lives, a figure General Claire Chennault repeated in his own reports afterward. No agency ever counted the dead district by district to confirm it, and modern historians treat the number as a wartime estimate, not a census, possibly too high by a wide margin. What is not in dispute is the scale beneath it. Market towns emptied, wells fouled, harvest burned, and a province that took years to feed itself again. By the time war crimes tribunals convened after 1945, American attention had already turned toward the Cold War, and the general accused of ordering the 3 executions had his case quietly shelved by occupation authorities more interested in Japan as an ally than in old debts. In China, the nationalist government that had organized the rescue lost its own civil war within a few years, and the new government in Beijing had little reason to memorialize a mission run by the side it had just defeated. The story slipped into the gap between 2 countries that had each moved on. Today, in a handful of villages across Zhejiang and Jiangxi, small stone markers and one-room museum exhibits hold what remains: a photograph of a rescued airman, a translated page from Father Dunker's satchel of letters, a well long since cleared and still drawn from every morning. No monument lists 250,000 names because no one ever wrote them all down. 64 men came home because strangers who owed them nothing carried them over mountains anyway, at a cost those strangers paid in villages most Americans have still never heard of. Had you heard this story before today? Doolittle himself believed the mission had failed and told his crew he expected a court-martial for losing every aircraft. Instead, he received the Medal of Honor from President Roosevelt within weeks, promoted 2 grades in a single ceremony. He never spoke publicly, in the years that followed, about the cost paid by the villagers who carried his men over the mountains. By most accounts, that silence was not indifference. It was a debt he did not know how to put into words, and carried privately for the rest of his life. Jacob DeShazer, one of the 4 flyers who survived Japanese captivity, returned to the country that had starved and beaten him for 40 months, this time as a missionary. He preached in the same islands his bombs had once targeted, and later corresponded with Mitsuo Fuchida, the pilot who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor. Their letters, by most accounts, spoke less of war than of forgiveness. DeShazer died in Oregon in 2008, the last of the raid's Japanese-held prisoners to pass. Ted Lawson lived another 4 decades on the leg Chinese villagers had helped save enough of to amputate cleanly, rather than lose to gangrene on a jungle trail. His memoir, dictated in a hospital bed, became the first widely read account of what those villagers had done, and the first most Americans ever heard of Zhejiang or Jiangxi. It said almost nothing about what came after the rescue. In 1942, no one yet knew the price. By the time Lawson published, the Japanese campaign was already history no one had counted. The general accused of ordering the executions of Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz stood trial in 1946. Was convicted and served a reduced sentence under American occupation policy. Field Marshal Hatta, who oversaw the broader campaign through Zhejiang and Jiangxi, was paroled in 1954, released into a Japan that America now needed as an ally against a new enemy. Nobody was ever tried for the reprisals against the villages themselves. There was no name for that crime on any charge sheet because no one had agreed, by most accounts, on how many people it belonged to. Ma Englin, the villager who guided pilot Harold Watson to safety, was reportedly burned alive when Japanese soldiers came looking for whoever had helped the airmen escape. His name survives only because Watson remembered it and repeated it, decades later, to a historian who wrote it down. Most of the men and women who fed, hid, and carried the flyers left no name behind at all. They are the 250,000, or the 10,000, or whatever the true number turns out to have been. Counted only in the estimate, never in the record. In Zhejiang today, a handful of village schools teach school children the story of the airmen who fell from the sky, and the neighbors who fed them anyway. American veterans' families have visited some of these towns, laid wreaths at wells their grandfathers were pulled from. There is no single national monument to the retaliation that followed in China or in the United States. The story survives the way it was made, in scattered pieces, kept alive by families on both sides of an ocean who never forgot, even when their governments moved on to other wars. 80 men flew off the deck of the Hornet that morning. 64 of them lived because strangers in villages most of them had never heard of chose, in a matter of hours, to risk everything they had. What those strangers paid for that choice can never be fully counted, and maybe that is the point worth sitting with. Some debts are not meant to be settled. They are only meant to be remembered by whoever is still willing to ask the question. So we ask it again. Had you heard this story before today?